Welcome back to the Autoblog Podcast. I'm Greg Migliore. We have a track special edition of the podcast for you this week. Automakers have a lot of track edition cars. That's what you have coming at you for this episode of the show. So I'm going to bring in a few of my friendly hot shoes from the staff here at Autoblog. We've got Road Test Editor Zac Palmer, Associate Editor Byron Hurd, and Senior Editor for all things green, Beltz Snyder. It's going to be fun about this show is over the course of doing this job, which is a pretty cool job on many days, you get to drive cars on tracks. That's just sort of part of it. Sometimes it's a little contrived. Sometimes you sit back afterwards, maybe have a pint, and you think, whew, what did I do today? That was pretty cool. So over the course of that, it's a little bit, Hemingway-esque. There's a little bit of a sense of adventure here. So with that, we're just going to get right into it, go over some of the tracks we've gone on over the course of our careers and have some fun with it. It's afternoon on a Friday. I have cracked open a key lime LaCroix. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, maybe you're enjoying something a little bit stronger. So, I will kick it off with a track that I thought was a lot of fun. I know a few of you guys have driven this too. It's Monticello, north of New York City. I guess you would say that's upstate New York, iffy sort of. I guess I should probably see what the Syracuse grad Zach thinks of that. John's driven that. I imagine most of you guys probably have. It's basically where JLR and sometimes BMW, they do a lot of events there because they're based in New Jersey. I remember when this place opened, there was a thought that it might be almost like a Formula One venue for the East Coast, which I could see that happening. It's a pretty interesting track. You could do different configurations of it. It's challenging. It's meant to sort of have that kind of like, almost like Western Europe sense of grandeur that you see on some of those tracks. I don't know if I necessarily go that far, but it's a nice track. I think it's a lot of fun to drive. I've driven several things, some JLRs. I actually did the 7 Series launch there about 6-7 years ago, which that was a fun car to take around a track. It didn't get around quickly, but it got around with a lot of, joie de vivre. Let me put it that way. So I think, Snyder, you've driven Monticello. What do you think of it?
Oh, man, I loved it. I drove it in the BMW 1 Series M Coupe.
Nice.
And
jealous.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, dream car, fantastic track. It was a really, really good course for that car. You could really sort of get it loose and just feel absolutely heroic. And then you've got that sort of straight at the end to, get it all out at the very end before you go back into the pit or go back across the line. But yeah, wonderful track. Not a lot of elevation change. So you can see things pretty well. And even someone who might be a little novice could feel pretty comfortable on that track. It's pretty wide. But yeah, just a really, really wonderful course. Some really nice sweeping curves. And you can, if you've got something that you can turn the traction control off, you can get pretty loose and carry some nice slides around those corners.
Yeah, it's a really, really fun track. We drove it was the Toyota GR86 there at the launch last year. And it was the first time I'd ever driven there. And they gave us kind of an intro where we sort of like took a short section of the track. And then in the afternoon, they expanded it and let us actually run the full course. And I mean, in that car, you really couldn't even get yourself in trouble. Like it's a very approachable track, but there were sections like at the back straight where like if you were in something high horsepower and maybe a little less friendly to a beginner, you could get yourself in trouble. Like there's a switchback section back there that's kind of mean. If you catch that curb the wrong way and you've got too much momentum in the rear end, you're going for a very unpleasant ride. But apart from that, it felt very, very confidence inspiring. I actually enjoyed that.
I've never driven Monticello before, but on the topic of upstate New York, as you mentioned there, Greg, I guess sort of, but also not really. It's a very complicated thing when you ask somebody from like Western or Central New York, like what is upstate New York? Because New York Cityers always say everything is upstate. But no, I really like to divide it between Western and Central. And Monticello is, well, I don't really think it's either of those. It's just close to New York City. But back to racetracks.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it was a pretty short helicopter ride from New York City, which
helicopter ride. Oh my God.
Really awesome. It was, yeah, it was a BMW trip. Let's put it that way. Put us up in Midtown Manhattan, and then they're like, we're going to chopper you up to Monticello. So, hey, it was a good time. Let's stay on the East Coast. VIR, Byron. You've driven a ton of things there. You actually lived in the DMV area for quite a while. I've never been to VIR. It's where Car and Driver does some of their what is it called, lightning lap. Almost every OEM does something out there. GM really seemed to be into throwing Camaros and Corvettes around that place for a while. What's VIR like? Never been.
I mean, it's beautiful. It's nowhere. It's. I mean, most of the good tracks are kind of in the middle of nowhere, but it's big and it's fast, and it is a very intimidating track. I mean, it was built in the 20s, I want to say, originally, and then it was abandoned for many years, and then they restored it and widened it, modernized it, so it's safer than it used to be. But I mean, when I was first really getting into driving on a track, that was when that "Damn It Tim" video was going around, where the guy put an Audi R8 into the wall through the climbing S's, and it was a personal vehicle, so that's why he was so mad. That section of the track is probably the most famous and the most intimidating, but God, it's so rewarding when you get it right. And flying through there in the Blackwings last summer was just an absolute blast. They did kind of short us on the back straight. They added in the bus stop back there just to make sure we weren't getting too crazy with the speeds, but it's just as amazing as I remembered it.
Anybody else been to VIR?
I have not.
Not over here either.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's on the list. Yeah, I don't know.
It looks from the lap times, it looks like a really long lap, honestly. I don't know if you can go ahead and attest to that, Byron, but one of the longer out there.
Yeah, especially if you're running Grand, which I actually haven't run the full Grand configuration. All the times I've been there, it just hasn't been available. So it's always been either East or West, or just I've actually run the Patriot course, which is the interior part that part of Lightning Lap runs on that. So like the interior is actually the most technical by far, and maybe the least enjoyable sections. You really can't get any speed in there. It's where a lot of people kind of get in trouble, and you bend a lot of wheels going off the curbs the wrong way and stuff like that. So not my choice for VIR track days, but I mean, it's still VIR.
I remember Ariel used to have an experience out there where you could drive the Ariel Atom, and that was like a bucket list lifetime sort of experience that I'd love to do. Driving the Atom at VIR would just be incredible.
It's also interesting just because it's located so close to NASCAR development. So a lot of road course testing was done at VIR. So occasionally you'd go out there for a track day and you'd like just see someone roll up in their, whatever their marketing promo vehicle was, and it'd be, Jeff Gordon in a Suburban or something like that. Just like, hey guys, we'll be on once you leave. So go fast.
That's amazing.
Somewhat similarly to that, only I think the ethos of the track and the vibe is totally different. But like your anecdote there, Byron, reminds me of just the layout out at Willow Springs. There's the Big Willow, if you will. There's the Horse Thief Mile, which I've done quite a bit of driving on. More like the street layout. There's a lot going on out there. I remember I was out there once for a Horse Thief Mile video shoot and some testing, and a bunch of GM engineers rolled up with one of the Camaro variants at the time. And it was interesting. It was like late January. They clearly did not expect Autoblog to be there with a full video crew, and they were not too happy to see us. But it was a fun track. Let me put it that way. You guys have driven, let's see, who's done Willow as I go through the list here?
I've done Big Willow.
Big Willow,
I did that in a Jeep SRT8.
Yeah.
Which flying down that second to last turn where you just really pick up speed downhill in that heavy vehicle, and then you've got that tight last corner after that was pretty harrowing, but it was really fun. I was really surprised with how well the Jeep handled it. Inspired a lot of confidence, and going out on the road after that, it was it felt perfectly comfortable in that car after that.
Yeah, it's an interesting course. I think it captures some of that like kind of West Coast vibe too. Like when I think of VIR, strikes me as like in the middle of nowhere, like you were saying, Byron. And Willow is just like, you're out in the middle of nowhere. I think it's a place called Lancaster, which is like unincorporated territory or something out there. Maybe it's a small city. And just even the drive out there is really nice too. You know, all the vistas you see. It's near, I think, an Air National Guard or an Air Force base. Speaking of random encounters I've had out there, some guy asked me if I was a flyer once because I think I was wearing aviators. I like aviators. And it's like, no. And I didn't even know what he was talking about. And then I kind of Googled a little bit more about where I was. And I'm like, oh, cool. There's they fly fighter planes out from around here. So it's a cool track.
It is. I've raced it a lot in Gran Turismo 7 now, actually.
Yeah.
It's just all of the sand. It really strikes me as like I've never been in any sort of a racetrack where there's sand as the runoff as opposed to grass and all these beautiful mountains in the distance. Just looks like a really, really awesome and sort of alien place to run around at.
Yeah, there are a lot of those California tracks too. Not just are they close to like military bases or airports and stuff. They tend to be close to prisons for some reason. It's just like let's build a military base, a prison, and a racetrack, and just get all the undesirable people in one place.
People who are not likely to complain.
Yeah, true.
About the noise.
You know you're going somewhere fun when you see the signs that are like, don't pick up hitchhikers. And you're like,
yeah, there you go.
Cool. Yeah, I'm driving this Lamborghini up the California coast. Let's just hope I keep doing everything right here and don't overheat or something. But the Horse Thief Mile over there is almost more like a film set, to be perfectly honest. It's this track kind of to the other side of the property. Frankly, a lot of the kind of like the terrain seems to get onto the track, as I use air quotes. But we drove McLarens and Lambos on it, and it was pretty awesome. We did a Mustang versus Camaro comparison on it once too. So that's pretty memorable. And we actually were there right after like Lexus was shooting like some sort of commercial back in the mid-teens, if you will, right when they were really getting into some of the F Sport, all the variants, if you will. So, friendly word to the wise for OEMs. There's a lot of film shoots going on out at Willow. So, what do we think about some of the tracks in Michigan? This might be kind of fun. Waterford is one. I know you've driven on there, Zach. It's actually pretty open to track days and stuff like that. So, I drove an Evo there back in 2008 and thought it was a riot. What have you driven up there, Zach?
Waterford is easily my favorite track around here.
Yeah.
Mostly just because it's very, very short, very tight, and can have a lot of fun in my Integra out there. You can actually keep up with some of the bigger power things. And it's definitely an older track. Maybe hasn't been maintained as well as a lot of other tracks. The surface can be a bit bumpy in places, but I think it's really cool and very charming. You're almost always moving the wheel. There's like the one back straightaway that I don't know. I can get up to about like 90, 95 miles per hour in my little 1.8 liter 4-cylinder. But for the most part, you're just constantly moving left and right, a lot of different sort of corners, and there's some actual elevation change, which you almost never see in this state, which is cool. You can really get the rear end out there if you mess that up badly. And there's actually a swamp that you can put it in if you royally screw up the final turn as well. You can oversteer and send it into some water. Just probably not an obstacle you see on a lot of racetracks out there. But easily my favorite around here. And it's cheap too. You can go do an open track day for like, let's say it's like $165, $175, and you get a lot of running time. So I've done a lot of open track days there and love it.
It's a nice way to spend the morning. I think they do open track days until like October, even up until October. So
I'm planning on doing one this October.
There you go.
100% my plan.
The only thing I would say I don't like it, but it's so curvy that it's almost like, to me, it's more like an Evo, a Mazda 3 kind of car. Like if you roll up in like a Z06, you have way too much firepower for that track.
Yeah.
Make friends with third gear and the brakes and just kind of hang out because it is what it is, but it's fun. It's pretty fun.
Last time I was there, some bro rolled up in his brand new Audi R8 V10, and that was not the vehicle for the track.
Fishing with dynamite.
He was getting run around and lapped by every Miata around. So just not the car you want there. Way too big, way too powerful.
M1 Concourse, which is sort of like the suburban one around here. It's in Pontiac, I guess, technically, right off Woodward Avenue. That's another one that I almost would compare to kind of like a diet Monticello. And it's going for something. It used to be an airport, actually, I believe Monticello. And it's just, they're trying something. They're going for that sort of sense of grandeur, just a real, they incorporate some different styles and there's a little bit of elevation change there too. I mean, that being said, it's still a pretty short track in the middle of the suburbs. So, it's fine. It is what it is. I drove a McLaren on it. I imagine probably most of you guys have taken laps on it too, right?
Yeah, now that I was actually thinking I don't really have anything to contribute to this part of the podcast because I've never really been on any Michigan tracks except at proving grounds and stuff, but I have actually driven M1. It was soaking wet. It was a Chrysler Alpha What's New event a couple of years back, but got to
that day.
Took the Julia out. And that was fun with all the nannies off. That was exciting.
You were there for that, John?
No, I James was there.
Right,
and I remember,
that's right.
Editing his stuff, and the videos and stuff that came in from that were hilarious.
A lot of autobloggers, past and present and future, at that one event. Yeah, that's an interesting track.
I know that I've had a GT350R, a GTI. I want to say one other thing that I'm not remembering right now there. It's a great track. I don't think that it's necessarily a great track for a beginner because the walls are very close.
Yeah, they are.
There is not much forgiveness if you screw up. But if you know what you're doing, you can have a lot of fun there. And I actually found, so I did it forward and in reverse, and I found that the reverse orientation is actually more fun than the forward. You end up getting a lot more speed up on the big straightaway there because you're instead of coming off the hairpin at the end, right, you're coming off a nice big wide sweeper, and it actually becomes a much faster track than you would have thought. So really dig M1.
That sweeper and that straightaway, you're literally, when you're basically at the point when you see this, the skyline of Pontiac, you really have to lift and to get on the brakes pretty quick because that's the tires are coming at you. You really need to get control of yourself, if you will. It's, I don't know. To me, that would almost make that the course a bit better. It's just an extra 100 yards or something there where you could really, just get on the car and see what you could do. I, somewhat stupidly had in my head that I think Andy Pilgrim, who's done a lot of different levels of racing, had including I think NASCAR actually road courses, had the top speed record there, and I don't even know who told me it. And I thought, well, okay, I'm just gonna lay on the throttle and just see just how high can I get this McLaren up to before I lose confidence. And I forget what it was. I could have literally been anything. The number I'll make up, I think, was in the 140s or something at that point before I just brakes. And then, there's a little bit of lockup and then just I wasn't going that fast given the conditions in the room. But I think that is kind of the signature part of that track, which is, it's, I don't know, considering it's mostly a lifestyle and car show venue, which many are,
yeah,
decent track, so. Mid-Ohio, we got to get to that one since we're in the Midwest.
Yeah, Mid-Ohio.
Who would put that as one of their top 5? I'm curious. Is that rank up there for anybody? That's
yeah,
definitely
okay.
Top 5.
Top half of my screen. I'm going to shut up. You two talk.
Zach, go for it.
Yeah. So I've only actually driven it with one car ever. That's my dad's 1991 NSX. We were there.
Okay.
Yeah. We were there as part of the annual NS Expo deal. So every single year, this NSX Owners Club goes to a different track around the country, and they run for a few days. So I was there. I was a freshman in college. I was 18 years old, and we went down to this track, and it was sort of wet, but also on the path to drying. And if anybody's been at Mid-Ohio before, they know that track in the wet is sketchy.
It always rains for Mid-Ohio, either before, during, or like somewhere. It every time.
Yeah.
Every time.
Yeah. And so this was like my second track day ever, and they're over there explaining like, all right, so there's this special surface down for the Indy cars. You have to take a complete opposite line than you would normally take. Otherwise, it's literally like you're driving on ice when you're driving on the proper line in the wet. So I got to learn the opposite line for my first session. My second session, it was sort of drying out. So like, maybe you can edge onto it a little. It's like, yeah, all right. There were 2 or 3 times where it got real squirrely, just because literally it does feel like you're driving on ice. And then my final session, it was totally dry, and I got to drive the track how it really should have been driven. And oh my God, it's so much fun. Madness is probably still one of my favorite corners ever. Yeah, I want to go back so bad and drive all of the cars there. So, Byron.
Oh man, I would so many times. Ugh. It was one of the first tracks that I was actually like a repeat for me. Strangely, it was too far away from where we lived because I was still back in Maryland at the time. So there were weekends where I was leaving at 7 a.m. on a Friday to get out there, be there by like mid-afternoon, and actually check in for the weekend festivities and everything. But yeah, the wet line there is the very first time I was there, my instructor basically told me, we tell you not to drive this line when it's wet, but I'm going to make you do it anyway because I want you to understand why you can't drive this line when it's wet. And fortunately, I was in a front-wheel drive car. It was my Mazda Speed 3, and it was on street tires. So, I had enough voids in the tread to actually get around when it was wet. I mean, the poor Miatas just couldn't go anywhere. But yeah, a couple laps doing that, even at kind of a moderate pace there while learning it, it really opens your eyes because, yeah, they put down those patches because the big power cars, the big aero cars just tear up that part of the track. And so they have to patch. The patch is basically just straight tar. And yeah, it's useless when it's wet. But such a fun track. I've driven it in both the configuration with the bus stop on the front straight and without. And going into the keyhole is always interesting, but coming out of it and going down that back straight through the kink toward China Beach is either terrifying or exhilarating, depending on the weather conditions. But it's amazing. It's an incredibly technical track, and there's a reason it's a pretty primo venue for big series in the US because it's incredibly fun to drive, and it's compact enough that as a spectator you can actually go kind of enjoy it because you can post up somewhere in the infield and you can actually see most of the track, unlike a lot of the road courses with that much elevation change where if you're around the corner you can only see a couple 100 feet. That Mid-Ohio, you can actually see most of what's going on around you.
Visibility really, to me, is like the great equalizer at almost any track. Like when you get into some different elevation changes, going back to Monticello a little bit, that's where honestly the nerves come up. And you almost, to me, almost my confidence gets a little less, or you just kind of do it and you're like, hey, okay, phew, that worked out. Thank God. But to me, it's courses where you have great visibility. It can really, it lets you pick them up a lot quicker. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Let's do some name brands. I'm looking through our list here. We've got Daytona. It's the road course, but still Daytona. Zach, what was that like?
Yeah, so even though it was the road course, you still get to go up on the banking, which is probably still the most memorable thing I've ever done on any racetrack. I was in the Acura Nsx Type S actually earlier this year, and we got to run it directly after this 4-hour BMW endurance race finished under the lights, which is probably as dreamy as it gets for running that track, just because they do the 24 hours of Rolex there, so you get to run it just like how they run it at night. But so I had driven this track hundreds, thousands of laps in Gran Turismo previously, so I had it memorized. But frankly, nothing could have prepared me for it going up on that banking and just how steep and violent it really was. The way that you simply just get shoved into the seats as you're going around that, picking up more and more and more speed. Nsx is a really, really quick car, so we were going quickly. We had Ryan Eversley, who is a Honda factory driver, leading the way. He was not going slow, which I really appreciated. Yeah, man, that's a huge bucket list item for me. And yeah, that I will not forget that track. I'm not sure when the next chance is that I will ever get to run it. But yeah, even just like I had 2 whole laps. And it was worth it and so much fun.
It's funny, for the really memorable tracks, you can either, for the really like famous ones, if you will, you don't need a ton of laps. You just remember like what it's like, that like sense of presence. I drove the F1 course at Monaco in the Audi S3 a few years ago, but it was like literally like open to the public just because it was just some random day in, I think, November. And that's just where Audi was doing the launch. They, of course, wanted you to work that into your story, that you drove that course, because it makes it sound even sportier than it was. But it was, yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool when you can do stuff like that. John, Indy, road course, but Indy.
Yeah, that was really cool. I drove that in the Challenger Hellcat wide body and the Durango Hellcat. And it was just, I mean, it's just such a cool venue with so much history. And then the road course is actually pretty good. No real elevation change, but man, it just feels great crossing the bricks, and that last straight, and just keep accelerating until that first corner. Pretty harrowing, but also it's one of those easy tracks to sort of memorize pretty quickly. And we actually had a little chicane that they set up before the back straight to keep speeds down a little bit. But man, even just standing next to the bricks and watching the Hellcats go by and listening to them, it was just really great experience for all the senses. It was, it's definitely one of those tracks that's memorable because of where it is and its history. But it's also, a decent drive and a lot of fun. And I got to do it in some cool cars.
I was driven around it by it was a Chevy Indy 500 trip a few years ago in the not Pontiac, I almost said Pontiac G8, Chevy SS. And it was pretty awesome. Not driving it, but just being in it and seeing the way the stands rise up. That's like 100-year-old structure. It was one of the first great like super speedways in the world, if you will, like literally double-decked sporting venues when it opened in like 1914, early 19 teens. They weren't a thing, so just the way they kind of hang over it, it's, like a Yankee Stadium, Fenway Park kind of vibe. And it's really awesome.
Yeah, I would love to go back. I would love to get a chance to drive the actual oval too.
Yeah.
Flat out,
that road
right?
course is pretty sweet. Yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah, 9/10, right? That's how you're going to take it. All right.
Yeah, maybe. It depends on what car I'm in.
All right. Laguna, Byron. That's a pretty big one. That's iconic. Corkscrew. I've stood on the corkscrew, but I've not driven it.
Yeah, I appreciated John's comment about getting to drive a course in a 1M coupe, because Laguna was a M2 launch a few years back. So that's a kind of similar experience. That was my first time at Laguna, and so far my only time at Laguna. But oh man, it completely lives up to the hype. That the entire last third of the track is so technical. And talk about like elevation change and not really knowing where you're going. The first time you crest that hill before the corkscrew, I mean, they put out cones and all that kind of stuff, and it was also like, their idea of the safe line for, journalists who may or may not know what the heck they're doing. But you get up to the top there and you've got cone telling you, okay, if you trust this, you're going to be fine. And then coming down on the far side of that and actually like getting into the corkscrew the first time is one of the best roller coaster rides I've ever been on. And the M2, I mean, talk about a great car for that kind of track, because plenty of power for the straights and a wonderful chassis for the technical sections. But I mean, talk about just bucket list tracks. Laguna is way up there, and
Absolutely.
that I'll admit, just no shame. They told us, like, as we're going out, if you're really confident here, you will go flat from that final turn all the way through turn 1. Through start finish, you will go flat. And the first time you come up over that hill flat will scare you to death in a street car, because you're going to catch air. And they don't tell you that. And when you come down from that and your suspension finally settles, you're aiming off the track at 135 miles an hour. So you need to be calm, collected, and comfortable enough to actually get the car turned to the left and set up for turn 1, or you're going to have a very bad day. So that's probably the most intimidating track I've actually been on, short of the Nürburgring Nordschleife. But I mean, that's a whole different kettle of fish.
Tell us about it. Never been.
So I drove the Nordschleife. It was the first track I ever drove on. I was actually there on a post-college graduation trip, and we were there on a shoestring budget. I had a Skoda Fabia Combi, which is basically a Volkswagen Polo wagon, with a 1.6 liter engine, I think it was, that probably made about 95 horsepower. And like I got some passes in. I took out a group of like college kids in a golf. So that, for me, that was big. That was like, the little Polo beating the big golf. So, I mean, just constantly spending the entire time as far offline as possible to let all the real cars go by was kind of terrifying in and of itself. But I mean, you can't replace that. It's funny, like my experience with it prior to that was driving it in video games, and the scale of it just doesn't translate to real life. Like that track is huge. Everything about that track is huge, because they've widened it over the years to try to keep people from dying on it all the time. And it's just, you kind of, you get in a tiny little car out there in the middle of the track, and it looks like there's a mile on either side of you. But once you get going fast, you realize how little of that you can actually use, and how bad your day is going to be if you're in the wrong part of it, especially in, a little street car that was a rental that I had no business whatsoever doing that with. But I mean, there was no way I wasn't going to do it. So at this point, I don't think Enterprise is going to come after me, but if they are, the damage has long been done.
How are the cement sections in that?
Honestly, like, because of being in the little Skoda and being surrounded by people who weren't, I really didn't get to, like, you didn't really get to play the carousel the way everybody else did. You kind of just had to make sure you weren't in the way. But honestly, being a street suspension probably made it better, because the transition from asphalt to concrete wasn't as dramatic as it would be if you were in a really stiff car. So it wasn't as upsetting. And frankly, I was just trying to make sure I didn't get us killed. So
nice.
Wild introduction to the track.
That's a track I would love to drive. I have this DVD that I bust out every once in a while, especially when like a kid is over and I hear that they like cars. I'm like, oh, check this out. It's 50 years of Formula One on board, and it's just the greatest DVD. But there's gosh, I haven't busted it out in a while because I can't remember who it is driving that. But just describing every little piece along the way. And, in these old 1950s F1 cars, it just sounds so harrowing and just so dangerous and scary. And I know it's been made more safe since then, but still, just knowing all the terrible things that have happened there would be in my mind when I would be driving it. But I still want to do it. Yeah.
I mean, even though it might be safer now, but I feel like it's still probably like the most dangerous track that you could go on out there. Is there any other track in the world that just allows random people to roll onto it and just all run at once, sort of thing? I don't think that there is at this,
It
right?
really fits in with that kind of like German ethos of like, on the Autobahn, like you can go as fast as you feel is safe, essentially, and the cars are like well screwed together to handle such things. And yeah, it's really a unique thing. I honestly, I don't know if I share like your interest in ever doing it, to be perfectly honest. I kind of want to do it. I'd like to say I did it, but it's like, it's extreme. Let's put it that way. So it's pretty cool.
I think the closest I've ever seen to that level of public access, this is going to sound weird, is actually Holly Glen at Hollyoaks ORV Park right here in Southeast Michigan.
Okay.
Because that's their like fast course, and it's a big, quick dirt track.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I don't want to say there are no rules there, but as long as you don't do anything ridiculous and get yourself actually thrown out of the park for being like deliberately unsafe, there are no speed limits on that track. There are no safety stewards on that track. It's pretty much just go and don't do anything dumb. And if you've got a 4x4 that can catch a little air and has little horsepower, you can spend your $20 and buy your rec stickers and go out there and just have a blast without any nannies. Really, it's kind of strange for an American environment, especially a public park, essentially. But so that we've got a tiny, tiny little taste of that here, maybe, kind of.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. There's a track I want to throw on here. It's the Utah Motorsports Campus, Motorsports Park, if you will. This is the one that the car dealer, Larry Miller, who I think he owned the Utah Jazz for a while. Maybe he still does. I don't know. But he was going to do this as basically his own track. And then there's a lot of, car enthusiasts in the southwestern U.S., and it just kind of grew, and they started having events. It's a pretty nice facility. For me, why this really resonated like so deeply was I drove the Ford GT there. And
nice.
I mean, sometimes the car, the place, the setting, it really sticks with you. I mean, it's a gorgeous venue with the mountains in the background. Some elevation changes, but it's not too wild. Couple of different configurations. I don't remember exactly how we ran it. I feel like we ran like half or 2/3 of it, mainly because I think they just didn't want you to get too far out because it's actually a pretty long course. And the layout is something that I really like. There's like there's a few long like straightaways, if you will. Some of the curves are kind of gentle. There's only a couple of real like hairpins that really, you got to really mind your P's and Q's and know what you're doing. It was cool. I mean, and then there were like, it does have some grandstands too. When like it wasn't sort of your turn, you could go up into the press box and do your notes or do your voiceovers, whatever it is you wanted to do. So there, not only did you have like the mountains and just this gorgeous like setting, it was also like a stadium feel, which definitely was an ego pump. And I mean, really, I remember waking up for that track day because the day before we went out there and we had dinner and they drove us around in like transits just to show us the track. And they don't always do that. And when they do that, you're kind of like, this isn't exactly a Focus 2-lapper at the Ford Proving Grounds. This is like, you want to get ready for this. And I remember waking up and at like 5:30 in the morning, and I was like ready to go. And like, for me on a press trip, the adrenaline doesn't necessarily start at 5:30 in the morning. Let me put it that way. And I was pretty psyched. And I remember I was with our producer, Chris McGraw, and we were being driven out to the track. And Journey, Don't Stop Believin' just came on the radio as the sun came over the mountains. And I was like, where am I? Is this real? Like, what is this? So it was pretty cool. I would say to me, it was like the highest level of like a press trip where you feel like you could safely test a really high performance car, but it's not like sometimes you get on a press trip and you're almost like, should we be doing this? This really felt like, to me at that point, and mind you, this is 2017, me reaching the apex of my abilities, so I don't know. To me, everything kind of came together. I don't know. Hope and history rhymes, as somebody likes to say. So that was a good
venue,
one.
and yeah, that venue was their most organized because that's where Ford hosted all of its performance driving things for customers. So like, what I bought my Fiesta ST new in 16, and ST Octane Academy came with the purchase. So they They put you up. All you have to do is get yourself there and back, and you get a full day of instruction. They had like a competitive autocross / gymkhana thing. I came in third, got my trophy.
Nice.
It was an okay day, but it was a lot of fun. And I mean, it was, anyone who bought a Focus or Fiesta ST was out there. They also did it for the GT350 and the GT, and it was, ST Octane Academy for the hatches. I don't remember what they called it for the bigger cars, but it was a really good setup. They did the same thing with us where we rolled around in the vans. They took us out to vantage points and let us watch the other students while they were doing their laps. So we could, they could point out, okay, he's doing it wrong. He's doing it right. And then in the afternoon, they let us go in a mixed group. And then they brought us back in and then had us go out in the hot shoe cars so that, we could ride and see how the pros are supposed to do it. And everybody was really upset on the Focus side because they would only run the Fiestas because the Focuses would overheat with the factory performance drivers out there, but the Fiestas wouldn't. So the Focus guys were super upset because they wanted to be out there in their cars to see what they could do. And the guys were like, well, unless you want to see your car overheat, you're not going to enjoy that quite as much as you think you will. So that was interesting. That was an interesting trip. But I agree with you, Greg. That was about as well put together as those events get.
Yeah, it was pretty memorable. Let's put it that way. And it was fun too afterwards. Just frankly, once you do something like that, you feel like you've accomplished something. So I had more than a few old fashions in the hotel bar afterwards. Props to Ford for not having a big dinner the following night. They were like, you know what? You can fly out if you want, which, okay, I don't really want to fly out at 8:30 at night, transcontinental flight. Like, hey, charge your room, great wood paneled bar, steak dinners, old fashions. I mean, it literally, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you almost needed to have a couple drinks at that point just to let your nerves simmer down and kind of just soak in what you're doing.
The GT was, I got to spend 20 minutes in one 3 years ago. It was one of the rawest cars of anything that I've ever driven. Literally feels like an actual race car in many senses. And so, yeah, I completely get why you'd want to go have a few drinks after taking that very quickly around a racetrack. I would probably be in the same boat with you there.
How about thermal? That's kind of a cool one. I've never done it. A couple of you guys have. What's that like?
Yeah, thermal. Man, that's probably one of the more recent tracks that I've been on. BMW had us out there last fall, and I got to drive a number of BMW M things. Probably the biggest fish in that pond was the M5 CS, 627 horsepower. That was easily the most powerful car I've ever driven on track, even more than that NSX Type S. The thing is a ballistic missile, and there is a lot of room to let that thing loose on thermal. Some really, really nice big wide sweepers, just tons of runoff room. A very, very safe track. I'd like to compare it a lot to Gingerman in Michigan, honestly, in that it's just felt like a safe place to be, and a really great place to exercise a ton of horsepower, which is what we were doing with that M5 CS. We had M3s, M4s in both rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive, and also BMW M240i's. So a whole lot of really, really quick BMWs, and a lot of grip, a lot of really hot temps just because we were out in Southern California. But they were all happy to do it. And yeah, I just really, it's also similar to M1 in that, it's this big facility in sort of the middle of nowhere, Thermal, California, which is 45 minutes outside of Palm Springs. And then all of a sudden you're in this massive BMW center. But yeah, it really felt like a luxury experience, and that, this is where you go if you have a McLaren 765 LT, you go by a garage here and then run on the weekends when you feel like it. So yeah, thermal.
I drove thermal in the Subaru WRX, the Type RA, and then the BRZ TS.
We were there together.
Yeah, we were, and I couldn't really get into it. Maybe I didn't have a car as powerful as the ones you were driving, Zach, but also that day it was really windy and there was just tons of dust and sand blowing across the track. You couldn't see anything.
Yeah.
But you did have some space to let loose with the cars a little bit, especially the BRZ. So that was cool. But yeah, as far as those like private club type places, I choose Monticello every day, and then there's one we'll get to it in a little bit, Club Motorsports in New Hampshire, which was still being built when I was there, but that track is just amazing.
I drove a track in New Hampshire once with a Challenger GT all-wheel drive. It was like a snow type of thing, though, where they do, I think the Team O'Neill Rally setup is there, which is very cool. I actually got stuck in the snow, which we may have video of that somewhere. I hope we do, actually, because it was an awesome drive. But what was that like? We probably should come back to some of these more like deep cut tracks. Like, that's one that's barely on my radar.
Yeah, so it was just being built when I did the Genesis G70 launch.
Oh, cool.
And the track was finished, but they hadn't built the garages and paddocks and all the facilities. But we got to drive the G70 on that. A lot of elevation change, some blind crests into turns, kind of like remind me of Sonoma Raceway, Sears Point. But really nice course. And then a couple weeks later, I went back and did it in the Challenger Hellcat Red Eye wide body, and they had some other Challengers there, like the Scat Pack, and it was it was really neat. Yeah, after driving it in those different cars, I actually liked my favorite car to drive. That was the Scat Pack. It was actually a little more fun with a little less power. Partly because you're going into a lot of it blind, but that sitting at the bottom straight, watching the cars go by, I just remembered how silently the Genesis went by, just whew, whew, whew. And then the Hellcat comes by. It's just completely different experience. But it was really fun in both those cars. And they also had a little karting track that they were building. And they let us do the 4-cylinder manual G70 on that little karting track, take a couple laps in that, which is kind of fun.
Nice.
But overall, the actual track there was beautiful. You're sort of up in the mountains. It's right across the border from Maine. The drive there was gorgeous. And yeah, it was just a really nice track. Some technical parts, a lot of big sweepers in elevation changes, and some blind crests, and it was pretty cool.
Yeah, they had the Grand Cherokee Trackhawk launch there too. So take the Hellcat wide body and add another 1,000 pounds. Right. It was exciting, but it was a lot of fun. And you're right, that was beautiful. They hosted us in Portland, in Maine, yeah. And so that drive was really nice.
Yeah, I would love to go back there. That would be the place probably if I was going to join a club somewhere. That would be the one.
You mentioned Sonoma. I don't think we've actually managed to touch on that one yet. Lovely track up in wine country.
Yeah, so I drove it when it was Infineon Raceway.
Oh, yeah.
Between it being Sears Point and Sonoma Raceway. I forget what the driving school is out there, but they were running Evos out there, so we got to do some laps in the Evos, and that's one where you come around a corner and go up a hill, and then you can't see anything over that hill. You're going, it's steep, and the instructor's like, yeah, you got to aim for that flagpole or that light pole. I forget what it was, but there's a pole that you have to aim for, and that'll take you where you need to go. And it feels like you shouldn't be aiming for it 'cause you feel like you're going off the track. But then, once you sort of crest, you're sort of in the clear there. But that one, that was a fun track. And then at the bottom, it sort of S's out, and then there's a hairpin by some walls. So that's one of those tracks where you gotta sort of keep your cool on it, and really try and look as far ahead as you can. Remember what you can from previous laps, and do your best not to do something stupid. But yeah, a really fun track.
A couple of European ones I want to mention here. Algarve, which is in Portugal. That was a very memorable trip. It's, Portugal is a beautiful country, frankly. I humbly suggest you go there if you can. Let me put it that way. I drove the E63S. This was back in 2018. So it was a 603 horsepower twin turbo V8. So a lot of car to drive around the track. They actually even brought out the Hammer, like from way back, like the 80s. Didn't get a chance to get in that one because I was still on the track. So I don't know. I don't necessarily feel too bad about that. I got another lap there. So that was pretty cool. And it's a pretty configurable track. We drove, like you do at most of these OEM events, a version of it. Long straightaway. There are some stands there. The curves are not super severe, which I think is kind of cool. I pulled up a map here, and it actually is kind of how I remember it. Like, you get through a couple of the more tenacious curves, and then you get some room to run. And then there's some curves that are definitely a lot more open, some sweepers. It was, for a little almost like forgiving, if you will, for journalists, which I think was pretty good. They've done some F1 testing there too, which was kind of nice. Yeah, it's a pretty cool place, I would say. Let me put it that way. It was definitely on the, I put that like almost in my like memoirs at some point, like, oh, hey, I got to do that. That was pretty cool. Another one that's also in that bucket, I drove it around that same time frame, is, where did I go? I lost this here. Circuito del Jarama. I think I'm mispronouncing that, but it's where they ran the Spanish Grand Prix for most of the 70s. So that's pretty cool. It's more of a motorcycle track right now. And I drove the Audi RS3 there. So it was pretty awesome, to be quite honest. Like, this is one that just a lot of history there, especially going back to arguably a real interesting time in F1, not arguably, really one of the iconic periods when the sport was displaying a lot of growth. Fun track too. And RS3 to me is like, I don't know, it's like one of the ultimate track cars you could get on a trip, because you're getting all of that 5-cylinder power, and it just handles like a top, to use that cliche. So it was really a good car for that kind of track where, to me, sometimes driving on track events like in Europe it could go one of two ways. One, you could feel totally disoriented because you're in Europe, at this point I had been in Spain for maybe the second or third time in my life. Where am I? What am I doing? Or after driving some of those routes that car companies put you on, through crowded old cities and sometimes in the UK, you're driving on the other side of the road, you're on the track and it all makes sense. There's nobody else around you and you could just focus on the car. And that's how both of those experiences were for me. And I remember there was rain involved a little bit too. I think it was with the RS3. I finished my lap. I had gone into the cool down phase. The rain started. I hit the windshield wipers, put down the windows, and was it was another one of those just kind of surreal moments, So a couple of cool ones. And I'll stick with my mythical tracks here. I drove Mont Tremblant up in Quebec. This was the Nissan Micra. You might remember that series. It was pretty fun. We drove the race cars. They were super easy to drive. Couldn't see out of them too well, just because they're so small. But it was a very interesting track too. Very underrated. You tend to think of Villeneuve in Montreal, where the F1 races are around the Canadian Grand Prix. But this is kind of I would almost compare it to a Mid-Ohio or something, and yeah, food was good. Beer was good. Good time up there. Drove some Canadian race cars. It was one of the more wild experiences. If you're ever in Quebec, I recommend that, and maybe seeing a Habs game too.
Awesome.
All right. I think we've hit almost everything on this list. Is there anything somebody wants to throw in before we go to, we'll close things out with the OEM tracks, which I think is kind of interesting. Anything I missed here?
There's one thing that I will throw out just because we're talking about things outside of the US. I got to do this Shelsley Walsh hill climb in the UK, which was, well, it's the first original hill climb. It's where they held the first hill climb event ever. And we got to do it in STIs and STI Type RAs, which was a blast. It's a really, really short thing. It was only about 40 seconds from the bottom to the top of the hill, which was really neat. But it was me, and there were maybe 11 or 12 other journalists, and we were all basically just over there vying for the best time up this hill. It was, as you got further and further up the hill, you lost the guardrail on the side, and it was just sort of like a drop. It was like a pretty decent drop on the left side. So you had to watch yourself there, but STIs were a pretty safe feeling car to throw up there. Just hammer on the throttle and let the all-wheel drive system figure it out. But that was honestly some of the most fun that I've had with any track, hill climb, whatever. Just the history there. We actually got to walk it before we got to drive it, which was a hell of an ordeal, honestly. It was steep, and it's a lot longer to walk than it is to drive it. We were all, everybody was drenched in sweat by the time we actually got to the bottom of the hill after walking up it and back. Yeah, hill climbs, I want to do more of them now because this thing was such a blast to do.
That's something I would love to try, is a hill climb. It just seems like fun.
Oh yeah, Pikes Peak, that would be the one. That's the dream one. But yeah, maybe one day.
Never done a hill climb. That's really appealing in some ways to me. Hey, it's almost like a different, I don't know, like fencing or something, just a sport that's so different than some of the other things that you might be comfortable with. So
just like cool. Byron, actually, I also got third in that. They were keeping times. There was no trophy. I think I got a ribbon of some sort for third place, but fun nonetheless.
Hey, a ribbon counts. That'll work, I think. OEM tracks. There's a lot of them, as they all have to have tests, cycles and ways to kind of shake down their cars. I kind of think the best one that I've gone on, the one I probably like the most, is the Chrysler one out in Chelsea. It's not that hard of a track. It was one of the first ones I went on, but I think the best one is the GM one. It used to be called the Lutz Ring because Bob Lutz was that was his thing when he came on as vice chairman and head of product. He was we're going to make these good cars. He did a lot of it didn't always necessarily pay off. It took a while, but I think he really changed the culture. And part of that was we're going to make some of our cars go really fast, and you still see that with Mark Royce, who's the president. And, he really is a good driver and cares about enthusiasts and the sporting element of it. But you might not think this, but I drove a Buick Regal around the Lutz Ring, and, it was all-wheel drive. It had that Turbo 4. It was basically an Opel. It was a hell of a lot of fun. And some of the turns were super tight. There was a turn they called some sort of bowl. I forget what exactly it was. It might have been the toilet bowl. I don't know. I can't quite remember it, but it was a really tight turn. And I remember I drove it, and my co-pilot, the engineer, who was really a great guy. I remember, I think I did a feature on him afterwards, this Buick chassis engineer. He just went through it you name it. He just really handled it so well. Great course, I thought. So that one ranks up there for me, I think, as far as the best of the proving grounds. But a lot of them are pretty good.
Yeah, I've been on the Chrysler one before, and that was good. Just like you were saying, it's a pretty straightforward course. there are some forests out there. I feel like you can go ahead and get something stuck in if you go a little too hard in a Hellcat. But for the most part, it is relatively easy. The one that I really liked was the unofficial Honda Marysville one. Say unofficial just because Honda doesn't technically own it, but Honda is basically the only one that uses it these days because it's right next to all of their facilities in Ohio. I got to drive a 2019 Acura Nsx on this track, and it was a blast. It was honestly one of the more technical tracks that I would expect from an OEM one. A lot of different stuff. You get up to a pretty high speed on the big straightaway too. Not much elevation change, and there wasn't much for scenery because you're kind of in farmland, Ohio. But it was a really great track with all sorts of different corners. Like, name a sort of corner, and this thing probably has it on it. So yeah, it was a good time, and with a fantastic car too. The NSX really, I mean, that SH all-wheel drive system, just hammer it, and it figures out a lot of things for you, and is never like a sketchy feeling car, especially when you're trying to learn a new track with it. It's just fast and safe feeling.
Sounds pretty good.
I've never driven any Honda tracks that I can think of, but I have been to Honda Twin Ring Motegi to visit the Honda Collection Hall there, and early morning, sun's rising, drinking coffee, watching the sun sort of come up over the mountains, and and the race course there was really cool. Have either of you guys been there?
Never.
The road course at Twin Ring Motegi was pretty awesome, and it was pretty close to the Honda Museum. So as I'm kind of collecting my thoughts, yes, I have been in there. I think it's the same one we're talking about. Yeah. So it's funny because I guess I didn't totally realize at the time it was necessarily Honda's course. I thought they just kind of had taken it over. But yeah, I mean, I did some Acura hybrid all-wheel drive like prototypes on that. It was super cool. It's actually the first time I drove a right-hand drive car, which was kind of on the grounds. And I was not disoriented by it, to be honest. I was kind of, actually rather enjoyed it. And that's a cool place. I mean,
really cool.
Yeah, I mean, in the history, and then you go to the museum and you're like, the museum is, I mean, it's one of those things where you drive that track, but then you go to the museum and it's just, it all comes together. It's pretty awesome.
That might be my favorite automotive museum that I've been to ever in the world. And I'm not like a particular Honda fanboy at all, but gosh, just incredible collection of cars and motorcycles that they have there. It's just really amazing to look at. They've got a Senna F1 car there. My jaw dropped when I came around the corner and saw that. We did a video out there. We when the Autoblog visited Japan, myself and Chris Migliore and Alex Malberg went out there and filmed a bunch of stuff, and we spent one day out at Twin Ring Motegi and went to the Honda Collection Hall. Had some ramen in the cafeteria there, and it was just really, really special place. A pilgrimage I would recommend to any Honda fan.
Yeah, I would probably lose my mind out there. Pretty sure. Yeah. That sounds like a bucket list thing that I need to do.
It was pretty epic. John, to your point, I just did a little fact checking. Honda built the place in the 1990s. Nice. So yes, it's definitely, this qualifies here. And I remember thinking back to the road course was pretty good. It was really like curvy, but it wasn't like, and they actually had us going at pretty slow speeds too, which in hindsight was kind of frustrating, but also just flight over there is pretty exhausting. I remember at the time not minding so much that they're kind of like keeping it like at a lower frequency, so to speak. Yeah, it's pretty epic. And then, you go see the museum, and, pretty great. Had a nice dinner in Tokyo, if I recall, later that evening. So it was really quite something. Cool.
Yeah.
Ford Proving Grounds. There's a couple of them. There's one in Dearborn. I've driven a bunch of stuff there, including a dump truck randomly. That was super random. Made a good video. Mustangs, things like that. For me, it's an old course that used to be, I believe, an airport. Notice a theme here. It's really close to like Greenfield Village. Some interesting curves, things like that. I actually took a performance driving course there a few years, like 10 years ago. Have you guys seen the meme a few years ago? It's like actually like 2006 or something. You're
Right.
like, oh yeah, it was a few years ago. And you're like, yeah, 2011, something like that. I remember I thought I failed. And the guy, because I was all over the place. I was a total mess. And then the guy handed me the certificate and I was like, oh, I get it. This is what the instructor does, is he like breaks you down, tells you everything you're doing wrong. But oh yeah, actually you're doing okay. This is how you do it better though and get faster. So that was a pretty good one. Chrysler Proving Grounds. I believe they actually still call it the Chrysler Proving Grounds. I went off track a little bit in the large Chrysler Dodge Challenger before it was all-wheel drive. So this is like 08, 09. I had gotten a little too cocky and kind of, went off track a little bit, went back on, didn't go far off track. It was one of those like press events where it was like the open house they used to do, where you could show up and you could go off-roading, you could go tracking, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, that one.
That was a good one. So I think we've hit all of them. GM, Ford, Chrysler in this area, Honda.
I gotta say the Ford. I've done the Ford Proving Grounds in Dearborn, but they also have one in Romeo, Michigan,
Yeah.
where I don't know if they still do it, but they used to offer Aston Martin customers a driving course, like a 2-day driving course out there. And I did the 1-day journalist version of it, and it was incredible. They have one small track that's sort of a copy of their a track that they have at their Lommel, Belgium Proving Grounds. Then they have a hill track that we didn't actually drive on that one, but there's just this sort of big hill out in the middle of this field, and they have a track going around it. Lots of elevation changes, and got to do a ride along with a pro in that. And that was scary as heck because you're flying over crests, blind crests at 120 miles an hour. And then we got to drive the 5-mile banked oval, which was fantastic. In the second to highest lane, it's completely neutral, going through the curves at 100 miles an hour. So if you're going 100, you don't need to steer in that lane. You just go straight. And then, as I'm driving past 150 miles an hour, the instructor next to me says, well, yeah. When the physics start to change when you cross 150 miles per hour, if a turkey comes across, it would just bounce off. But now that we're going over 150, it would go through the windshield and decapitate you. It's like, oh, cool, thanks.
Fun fact.
Yeah,
something
and then they have
that you'd like them to tell you at like the traffic or the shakedown ahead of time, the safety precautions. Look out for turkey.
Or just wait till completely afterwards. Then not tell me like as I'm crossing that 150 mile per hour line that that turkey could kill me. But they also have a mile-long drag strip that was really fun too. That was a really cool spot. And I'm glad that they open it up to at least some of the public, the very wealthy public. But
yeah, I did an
really
F-150 cool off-road drive up there, and talk about challenging off-road courses. I don't know if it's like intentionally this challenging, but like you're in the middle of like northeast, I think, Macomb County, Michigan, like north of Detroit, like you're out there and it's like pretty raw and uncut. And I remember some of these like F-150s, I was kind of thinking, I don't really think many F-150 owners are going to be doing this with their trucks here. And then afterwards, sort of like what you said, John, there, where they're like, by the way, we almost didn't do this because it rained and it's a little cold and basically the trails were washed out. Whoops. Really glad I didn't know about the turkeys running around though either. That would have gotten in the way because you're really out in the middle of nowhere. But it's a pretty cool place.
Yeah, they've got deer out there too. Like,
Yeah,
they've got people, I think, like sort of driving around the grounds and trying to spot them too. So
cool.
Giving you a heads up. But yeah, fun place.
All right. Well, we've somewhat thematically talked about having a few after your track day. It is the waning days of August. By the time this drops, it will actually be September when you're listening to this. It's for Labor Day weekend, so it could go either way. Last weekend of summer, maybe Tuesday afterwards of Labor Day, it's fall as far as a lot of people are concerned, even though it may not be super hot. Long story short, you can drink whatever you want. What are you drinking this weekend?
You know, I've got some stouts that have been sitting in my fridge downstairs for a few years, and I picked ones that could sort of age well and just didn't touch them. But there's a Odd Side of Ales bourbon barrel aged Mayan mocha stout with my name on it. I know it's not really the best hot weather sort of beer, but you know, it's got that sort of heat to it from the chili peppers in it, and it just sounds so delicious right now. It sounds almost like drinking ice cream.
I honestly went a very similar way as you did, John, with my grocery shopping for beer this week. I went and picked up a Dogfish Head a pumpkin ale. So
you guys are not messing around here.
I went full fall. I don't know if that was the greatest choice. I also got a 6-pack of Oberons just to sort of balance out the summer and fall vibes. Just whichever one I'm feeling. I've already tried one of the pumpkin ales, and it's very good. It's got nutmeg, allspice, ginger, and pumpkin in it, and it just tastes like Halloween. So
wow. You guys are not messing around here. I mean, it's a little cooler today when we're recording it, and sometimes September the temps start to twist a little bit early. I always like that, actually. I'm working my way through a case of the Alaska Brewing Company, and it's a variety pack, so it's pretty good.
Yeah, they've got some good stuff, man.
Well, I've been trying all of it. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember having that when I went on a cruise there once, and I was like, wow, this is really good. And then it started popping up in Michigan. I was like, all right. Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah, the Pilsner is nice for more like mid-August. You get the IPA. It was kind of a juicy IPA, a little bit higher alcohol level, but that's a nice, really all year round kind of beer. And then, like you guys, I've got a few of the ambers, which to me is the quintessential fall beer. So I will be popping those probably really starting anytime. But essentially, as you move into September, to me, amber ale is the go-to choice. So
fair enough.
It's been fun hanging out with you guys.
Same.
Yeah.
Cool. We'll have to do more of these track shows, more maybe special shows, if you will. Listeners, let us know what you think of this. Get in the comments. Send us your feedback, your spend my monies. That's podcast@autoblog.com. If you enjoy the show, this show, any show, and we hope you do, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get the show. Be safe out there. Be safe on the track, and we'll see you next week.